Hi, welcome to another edition of AI in the Classroom Daily. My name is Dan Cogan-Drew, co-founder and chief academic officer at Newsela. The goal of this podcast is help educators make sense of AI without all the hype. And today I want to start with a tension that is ever present in this era of AI, and that is in AI's ability to optimize. What can AI take off of a teacher's plate? And just because it can take that work off of their plate, do we want it to? What is the role of AI in the classroom, and what is the role of the teacher? And nowhere is this issue more present in the minds of teachers and those who work with them than in writing, where writing has been an area that AI has shown to be useful. It's not an easily dismissed use case. AI is capable of reading students' writing, comparing it to the criteria set forth in a rubric, providing feedback to students on that writing based on that rubric, based on the assignment, even giving that writing a score according to the rubric or other criteria. So it can do the work, but what part of the work should it actually be doing? And to look at that question, I went back to an article that was published in February of this year in EdSurge. The article is entitled, "What Students Gain When Teachers, Not AI, Grade Students' Work. How a lawyer turned teacher turned AI ethicist used assessment to personalize instruction before AI-powered edtech existed." And the co-authors of the article are Masheka Allgood and me, Aniefuna, and they go into some detail describing Allgood's classroom teaching experience. And what the author is arguing through relating her personal experience here is that the role of diagnostic testing, what I would call formative assessment, and responsive instruction based upon the data, based upon the insights and learnings using that formative assessment, were responsible for much greater than expected gains in her students' writing. Over the course of the year, she had students who were not writing proficiently advanced to the point where by the spring assessment by her administrator who came to observe, she says the administrator could not tell the difference between the students who had started the year much further behind than their grade level peers and those grade level peers. And that she attributes to being intentional about using assessment to diagnose areas of need, respond with instruction tailored to those areas, all of this backwards mapped from the destination that she knew her students needed to arrive at by the end of the year, and being systematic and disciplined about an instructional response informed by data and continuing to reassess those areas after instruction. This, to me, is a very strong example of what good teaching looks like in the teaching of writing, where Allgood was able to isolate the skills where students needed the most help, effectively apply instruction, and continue to assess in those same areas to measure improvement, to see where further instruction and further adjustment needed to be made. And this is not to be taken lightly as a body of work. This is a tremendous amount of effort on the part of Allgood. So it's a great example of what teaching can achieve, what great teaching can achieve. And I think the tension comes in where those of us who have taught writing, and I'm a former high school English teacher, we know how much work it took for Allgood to do this. And one of the challenges, I think, that many writing teachers face is that if they see themselves, as Allgood did, as the reader and the diagnoser of challenges with relation to writing and the one who's best positioned to address these, then they need to read an awful lot of their students' writing, sometimes to the point where the only writing that students will do will be writing for the teacher to read. I don't know that was the case in Allgood's classroom, but there was certainly a point in my own instruction when I realized that, and I told my students this, if you're only writing as much as I can read, then you're not writing enough. Because there's no way that in the time it takes for me to read everything that you've written and give you feedback, and then for you to revise and resubmit, if we have to go through that cycle each time, and there are 60, 80, 100, more than 100 of you, I'm not going to be able to get those papers back to you to provide timely and specific feedback, which John Hattie will tell you is key to advancing instruction, I'm just not going to be able to do that. So you're going to hand in your paper on a Friday, and I'm going to work through the weekend, and maybe I'm going to get it back to you on Monday if I'm really heads down all day, Saturday or Sunday. But even from the time from Friday to Monday, you've had a weekend to forget all about what you wrote. And when I hand it back to you, it's hard to say that's timely, but it's the very best that I can do as a teacher because there's more than one of you and I have to read all of your writing. So I cleverly came up with ways, as many teachers do, to hack my way through the volume of words that you need to write as a writer and the volume of words that I can actually consume and read as a teacher. I would have students pair their writing, exchange their writing with a peer editor. I would sometimes check their work in a cursory way to make sure that they were doing writing, but I didn't have time to read it all, and so on. I'm sure there are a lot of teachers who live with those hacks. And I think it's one of the many sacrifices that writing teachers are making when they're trying to figure out how to solve the problem that there is only one of them and there are scores and scores of students. Along with that, some of the other challenges that make the allure of applying AI to writing feedback and writing grading are the human nature of being a human trying to teach writing. For example, when I was given a stack of 60 essays to read, I was not as capable a grader and a giver of feedback on every one of those essays. I would use the first 10 to calibrate my reading of what students' writing was going to look like on this given topic. And then I would be calibrated and effective, let's say, for the next 40 essays. But by the final 10, and I'd been at it for 4 or 5 hours, I would start to flag. And my feedback on each piece of student writing towards the end of the pile was not as good as it was in the middle. And there was no controlling where you might land as a writer and what kind of feedback you might get from me. It was also the case, and I have to admit this, I didn't have the same relationship with every student. Part of being human is that we had a relationship, we had a history, and there were times when the feedback that I was giving to a student was feedback they were receiving from me, who they knew personally, and didn't always land well, wasn't always something that they were ready to receive. That's work for them to do, but it doesn't necessarily lead to better writing because there's an emotional friction to the feedback they're receiving. Now, AI is not a solution for all of this. We know that AI has biases. I was speaking earlier in a podcast a couple of episodes ago about it's been shown that AI can be biased simply by knowing that the user it's interacting with comes from a non-traditional educational background, comes from a non-English speaking country. There are a number of conditions that will prompt it to provide information in a condescending way or withhold information. So we know that AI is not perfect, but we do know that machines don't sleep and machines will attack the next piece of writing with the same energy that they read the first. However, there are inconsistencies and hallucinations. So the bottom line here is that you have a trade-off as a teacher, as an administrator, bringing the technology into your district. And I think what Allgood's paper shows is the strong value of the teacher and the role that the human can play when unassisted. This is what is possible. And each educator, each administrator needs to ask themselves how they're going to negotiate the balance between the optimizations and time savings that the AI can bring, and on the one hand, and on the other hand, the teacher's need for sustainable, scalable practices that get them to return to the classroom on Monday as energized as they were when they left on Friday. So that's the trade-off. Welcome your thoughts in the comments. Would love to know how you're negotiating this balance. And if you haven't read this piece in EdSurge, I highly recommend it. Until next time, Dan Cogan-Drew signing off.